Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay with us on every journey into Forgotten America. Now let us step back to 1885. When the forests outside Los Angeles held secrets that men would enter, but few would ever return to tell. The San Gabriel Mountains in 1885 were not the place of hiking trails and picnic spots that you might know today. They were rugged, harsh, untamed, filled with shadows that could stretch for miles without breaking. The forests of pine and cedar towered over ravines so deep that sunlight rarely touched the ground. The rivers cut through stone with a voice like thunder, and at night the wind carried the cries of animals that many swore did not belong to any living thing. In that year, Los Angeles was a town of rapid growth. Railroads were coming, farms spreading, and new arrivals flooding in. But the mountains just to the northeast still held something older, wilder, something men could not tame. And yet, as with all frontiers in American history, men tried. The story begins with a group of 125 men, mostly loggers, trappers, and fortune seekers, who set out on mission deep into those forests. Officially, they were there for timber. The giant pines and cedars were worth fortunes in lumber mills. Some said gold had been spotted in the rivers as well, a rumor that always drew men west like moths to a flame. Others were simply laborers, hoping for steady pay in a land where steady pay was hard to find. The group was a rough mix. Former soldiers who had fought in the Civil War, immigrants from Ireland and Germany, local men from Los Angeles who knew the edges of the forest but never dared too deep. A few were criminals, hiding from the law under assumed names. And some were simply dreamers, young and restless, hoping the mountains held a chance at a new beginning. What united them was a promise riches, adventure, and a camp that would grow into something more. They called it Camp Angelus. Though no angels would ever bless that ground. At first, the camp was filled with the sounds of life. Axes rang against wood. Fires burned at night with laughter around them. Men shared stories of old battles, of distant homes, of women left behind. Some carved their names into trees, claiming the land as if by writing it they could own it. There was hope in the air. But then the forest began to change them. It started with silence. The woods, which had seemed alive with bird calls and animal sounds, grew strangely still. Men said the silence was worse than the howls of wolves, worse than the growl of bears. It was a silence that seemed to listen. One logger, a man named William McBride, wrote in his journal, "When the night comes, the trees lean close, as if they are whispering to each other. The men laugh at me, but I swear the forest watches." Soon after, men began to vanish. At first, it was explained away. A trapper could have fallen in the river. A logger might have slipped on the cliffs. But when more men disappeared, sometimes in daylight, sometimes with their tools still lying in the dirt, the camp grew uneasy. One morning, 3 men went out to cut timber near a ravine and never returned. Their axes were found, their lunch, satchels still untouched. The ground around their worksite was torn as if by wild animals, but no blood was found, no footprints leading away. Just emptiness. At night, the survivors began to hear voices. Some swore they heard the laughter of children in the trees. Others claimed to hear their own names, whispered just beyond the firelight. A former soldier, Corporal Thomas Renshaw, awoke screaming one night, insisting that he had seen faces, dozens of them, watching from the shadows between the trees. The leader of the group, a man named Captain Elias Morton, tried to keep order. He was a tough, weathered man, a veteran of the Union Army, known for discipline. He told the men that fear would kill them faster than anything in the forest. He ordered patrols, rationing, and insisted they continue cutting timber. But the more he pushed, the more men resisted. Arguments broke out. Fights turned violent. One night, a drunk gambler named Patrick Foley pulled a knife on another logger over claims of stolen food. By morning, Foley was gone. His knife was found stuck in a tree, but his body was never seen again. The forest seemed to be swallowing them whole. By midsummer, over 20 men were gone. Some slipped away quietly, deserting the camp. Others vanished in ways no one could explain. The ones who remained grew gaunt, their eyes hollow, their laughter gone, and then came the rains. That year, 1885, was marked by sudden storms in the San Gabriels. Rivers rose, trails washed out, and the camp found itself trapped between cliffs. And torrents of water, supplies dwindled. Hunting brought back little. And in the endless nights of storm and thunder, the whispers grew louder. Some men began to lose their minds. One was found sitting by the fire, rocking back and forth, muttering about the watchers in the trees. Another tried to run into the storm, screaming he would rather drown than stay another night. It was then that Captain Morton made a decision. He would lead the men deeper into the mountains, away from the ravines and storms, to find higher ground, and possibly a route back toward Los Angeles. Many resisted, but the choice was starvation or movement. So the camp packed up what remained of their supplies and marched into the darkest part of the forest. That march would seal their fate. The deeper they went, the more unnatural the forest became. Trees twisted into shapes that looked almost human. Roots stretched across the trails like veins. The ground grew damp, the air heavy with rot. Men swore they saw shadows moving against the light, though no living thing was there. One night, as they camped near a clearing, a scream tore through the camp. When they ran to investigate, they found one of their strongest men, a blacksmith named Heinrich Bauer, lying in the dirt. His chest was torn open, but not by claws or teeth. It looked as if something had burst from within. His eyes were wide open, his face frozen in terror. From then on, panic ruled. Men stopped trusting one another. Food was hoarded. Groups split off into smaller bands, some vanishing into the trees, never to be seen again. Captain Morton tried to rally them, but even he began to show cracks. His journal, later found near the site, contained entries that shifted from discipline to madness. One line read, "They are not animals. They are not men. They are the forest itself. It wants us. It takes us." By the time autumn came, of the 125 men who had entered, barely 30 remained together. They were starving, sick, and broken, and the forest was not done with them yet. By the first days of October, the forest had taken the fight out of most of the men. What had begun as strong backs swinging axes had turned into hollowed bodies, stumbling through the underbrush, eyes sunken, lips cracked, minds frayed. 30 remained with Captain Elias Morton, though no man looked at another without suspicion. Trust was gone, replaced by a dull fear that gnawed at their bellies harder than hunger. The storm season had left trails impassable. Fallen trees blocked passages, and the rivers swelled into walls of water that crushed anything daring to cross. Hunting brought nothing. Traps were found empty, sometimes broken, sometimes torn apart in ways no one could explain. Men began to speak openly of curses, of the land itself turning against them, and the land did feel cursed. At night, the men swore they heard chanting, faint but steady, like a hymn rising from the forest floor. It came from no direction they could trace, sometimes drifting close, sometimes echoing far. The youngest in the group, a 19-year-old from Missouri named Daniel Fenton, fell to his knees one night, covering his ears and screaming that the voices were inside his skull. He clawed at his face until blood poured down, and the men had to hold him down to keep him from blinding himself. The next morning, Daniel was gone. His bedroll was still warm, but the ground around it was untouched, not a footprint, not a drag mark. Just gone. Every disappearance felt like a tightening noose. Men began to stay awake all night, clutching knives, afraid that sleep itself might invite whatever stalked them. But exhaustion was a thief, and one by one, men drifted off into uneasy slumber sometimes, never waking again. Captain Morton pushed the group onward, his once commanding voice now hoarse, more desperate than strong. He told them salvation lay further north, where a canyon might lead them back toward the lowlands and out to Los Angeles. "We only need to endure a little longer," he repeated, though his eyes betrayed the same dread that gripped them all. His words were no longer the bark of a leader. They were the prayers of a man holding himself together by threads. Then came the night of the fire. They had camped in a small hollow. The men huddled around the flames, too weak to even talk. The silence was broken by a shout, then another. Two men were wrestling, fists cracking against bone, rolling dangerously close to the fire. It was over food. A scrap of dried meat one accused the other of stealing. The fight turned brutal, knives flashing. By the time the others pulled them apart, one man lay bleeding out, his throat cut open. The other, shaking, dropped his knife and sobbed that he hadn't meant it. Morton ordered the dead man buried, though the ground was hard and rocky. They dug only a shallow grave. That night, as rain poured down, lightning illuminated the hollow. The men swore they saw the fresh mound shift, as if something beneath the soil was trying to rise. By morning, the grave was empty. No one spoke of it, but no one ate that day. By late October, the men had dwindled again. Some slipped away quietly into the night, believing they could find their own path. Others were taken by the forest in ways too strange to explain. One man, a Spaniard named Cruz, was found standing at the edge of camp, staring into the trees. When another approached, Cruz turned, his eyes blank, and whispered, "They're waiting for you." Then, before anyone could move, Cruz stepped into the woods and was never seen again. Of the 125 who had once marched into the mountains, barely 25 remained. The group was starving now. Men chewed on bark, roots, leather straps. Some whispered of cannibalism, though no one dared say the word aloud. Yet hunger has a way of stripping away humanity, and the first act of it came not from savages, but from desperate, ordinary men. When another logger, thin as bone, collapsed and died on the trail, the men buried him or seemed to. But the next morning, his grave was disturbed, his body torn apart, and scraps of cooked meat were found in the fire pit. No one confessed, no one accused, but everyone knew. After that, the group no longer looked like men. They looked like animals circling one another, waiting to see who would fall next. Captain Morton, though gaunt and weary, still tried to keep a remnant of order. He made them march by day, made them keep camp by night, made them sing hymns to drown out the whispers. But even he was unraveling. His journal entries shifted from commands to confessions. One read, "They come when we sleep. They take not the body first, but the mind. They hollow us from within until nothing remains but skin walking. I cannot save them. I cannot save myself." The forest seemed endless. Every day the men marched. Every night they collapsed. And still the trees pressed in, thicker, darker, as though the deeper they went, the less they belonged to the world of men. The breaking point came in November. They had reached a gorge, the river below roaring with winter melt, the opposite side a sheer wall of stone. There was no way forward, no way across. The men fell to their knees, some crying, some laughing like madmen. The gorge was a dead end, a wall that told them plainly they would not leave. That night the camp descended into chaos. Some men demanded. They turned back. Others shouted that turning back was impossible, that the forest behind was worse than death. Knives were drawn again. Screams split the night dot when morning came. 6 more were gone, 3 dead from fighting. 3 vanished without trace. Only 19 remained, and worse than the numbers was what they saw when dawn lit the gorge. Across the river, on the opposite cliff, stood figures. At first, the men thought it was their lost companions, waving, calling them across. But the figures were wrong. They were tall, impossibly thin, their limbs too long, their faces pale and featureless. They did not move like men. They swayed as though the wind itself held them up. The survivors stared in silence, too afraid to speak. Then, one by one, the figures turned and drifted back into the trees, vanishing like smoke. That sight broke something inside the men. Some tried to leap into the river, only to be swept away. Others curled up, refusing to move at all. The rest followed Morton, who led them back into the forest, though his face was gray and his voice cracked. From then on, their numbers dwindled fast. Men walked away without reason, into the shadows, never to return. Others fell in madness, clawing at the trees, begging the forest to take them. By December, only 11 men staggered out of the mountains. Starved, frostbitten, eyes hollow as graves, they collapsed on the edge of civilization near the settlement of Pasadena. When locals rushed to help them, they found men, unrecognizable skin, stretched tight over bone, hands trembling, some unable to speak more than broken whispers. The worst came when they were questioned about the others. Some refused to answer. Some wept. One laughed until he choked. And one, shaking violently, finally whispered, "We didn't all die in the forest." Some of them stayed behind, but they weren't men anymore. The story spread quickly. Newspapers carried it in hushed tones, calling it a tragedy of wilderness, a lesson in the dangers of untamed land. Officials declared it a failed timber expedition. But those who saw the survivors swore the truth was darker. For though 11 had returned, none of them ever truly came back. When the 11 survivors stumbled out of the San Gabriel Mountains in December of 1885, they looked less like men and more like walking corpses. Their clothes were in tatters, their skin blistered from frost and sun alike, their eyes sunk in hollows that seemed to look past the living. People in Pasadena who saw them swore they would never forget the sight. One woman later testified that when she offered bread to one of the men, he took it in trembling hands, pressed it to his face, but never ate. He simply wept as if bread itself was too much to bear. The town doctor, a man named Dr. Charles Wentworth, was summoned at once. He examined each of the 11 and wrote in his notes, "These men suffer not only from starvation, but from some manner of terror that clings to their very bones. They tremble as though cold when the air is warm. Their eyes are those of men who have seen something beyond reason. It is not mere exhaustion. It is a haunting. The authorities wanted answers." The Los Angeles Herald sent a reporter, and soon the survivors were being questioned. But the men could not, or would not, speak plainly. Captain Elias Morton, who had once stood so tall, was now barely recognizable. His beard was matted, his uniform jacket shredded. When asked what had happened in the forest, he answered only, with a whisper, "The forest kept them." Others gave fragments of testimony. One man swore they were hunted by tall shadows. Another insisted that their comrades had turned against them, killing one another until nothing was left. Still another said simply, "We starved and we sinned." No 2 stories matched, and the confusion only fed suspicion. The newspapers seized on the mystery. Headlines ran wild: "Massacre in the San Gabriels," "Logging Camp Doomed," "Survivors Tell of Madness in the Mountains," 11 return, 114 lost. Speculation grew. Some said the men had turned to murder and cannibalism. a tale not unlike that of the Donner Party decades earlier. Others claimed the mountains themselves were cursed, that the land was never meant to be cut or settled. Local native elders were asked, and some gave cryptic warnings. The mountains take back what is theirs. But behind the headlines, the reality was even darker, for the 11 survivors were not healing. Instead, they began to waste away, even with food, even with shelter. Dr. Wentworth noted in January of 1886, "Though fed and clothed, these men grow thinner each week. It is as though something within them has been consumed and cannot be replenished. They speak in their sleep. They wake screaming. Their health declines without cause." And there were stranger details. Townsfolk swore that when the survivors walked through Pasadena, animals fell silent. Horses shied away. Dogs barked until hoarse. Children cried at the sight of them. Some claimed shadows lingered too long around the men, that their outlines and lamplight did not match their bodies. One survivor, a logger named Isaac Turner, was found dead in his boarding room in February. His body was withered, his eyes wide open, his mouth frozen as if in a scream. On the wall above his bed, scratched into the plaster, were the words, "They are still with me." The town began to fear them. Whispers spread that the 11 had brought something out of the forest with them. Some locals demanded they be sent away, lest their curse spread. Others pitied them, but dared not come close. By March, 2 more survivors were dead. One drank himself to death. Another wandered into the Arroyo Seco and was found drowned, though the water was shallow. That left 8. The authorities launched an investigation into the expedition. Captain Morton was summoned to give testimony before county officials. Witnesses described him as broken, staring into space, speaking in fragments. When pressed on what had become of the missing men, he broke down, pounding the table, shouting, "They chose the trees. They chose the shadows over us." He had to be restrained and carried from the room. The inquiry concluded with no clear answer. Officially, the deaths were blamed on starvation, exposure, and internal violence. But privately, even the investigators admitted the accounts did not add up. How could so many men vanish without trace? Where were the bodies? The mountains, it seemed, had swallowed them whole. Among the survivors, madness grew. One began carving strange symbols into wood, muttering that they would keep the watchers away. Another refused to sleep indoors, claiming walls trapped the voices inside. And then there was the matter of what they refused to say. Whenever someone asked directly about what they had eaten, their faces twisted with shame and fear. Some denied it outright, some wept, some laughed. But none gave a straight answer. By the summer of 1886, of the original 11, only 5 remained alive. Each had grown frail, their hair gone white, though most were barely past 30. They avoided people, lived like ghosts in the town that had once welcomed them. It was then that the forest itself began to reclaim its silence. Locals reported strange sounds at night, drifting down from the mountains. Drums, chants, sometimes screams. A few brave hunters who went into the San Gabriels came back pale, refusing to speak of what they saw. One swore he saw men moving among the trees, though no human camp was found. Some whispered that the missing were not dead at all, that they still roamed the mountains, no longer quite human, but not yet gone. Captain Morton lived the longest. For years, he stayed in Los Angeles, a shadow of the man who had once led 125 into the mountains. He kept to himself, often seen scribbling in notebooks that no one else was allowed to read. In 1892, 7 years after the expedition, Morton died. In a small rented room. Among his belongings, a final journal was found. The last entry read, "I hear them at night, in the trees outside. They do not forgive me. They do not forgive any of us. The forest was never ours. It waits, always waits. And when I close my eyes, I see them still tall and hollow, swaying in the dark. The 11 who walked out were not the ones who went. In, we left pieces of ourselves behind, and they are still there. The journal was quietly locked away, too disturbing for public eyes. But word leaked, as word always does by the turn of the century. The 1885 expedition had become local legend. Some called it the Lost Camp of Angelus. Others called it the San Gabriel Curse. Parents warned children not to wander too far into the mountains, for fear the forest would take them too. And the truth? The truth was buried with the men who never came back. But the strangest part of all was this. Of the 11 who returned, not one left descendants. Not one married, not one bore children. Their lines ended with them, as if whatever they brought back from the mountains made sure it would never spread further. And those who still live near the San Gabriel Mountains swear that, on certain nights, when the wind is just right, you can still hear the voices. Faint, hollow, carried through the trees. Some say it is the missing men, calling for help. Others say it is the forest itself, warning us never to return. Time passed, but the story of the 1885 expedition never truly faded. In Los Angeles, the city was growing fast. By the 1890s, railroads were carving paths, oil wells sprouted, and the once quiet town was becoming a city of lights and ambition. But north, the San Gabriel Mountains remained untouched in many places. Their peaks jagged, their forests thick, their canyons deep. Locals did not forget what had happened. The tale of the 125 who entered and the 11 who returned became part of whispered conversation, especially on cold nights when the mountains loomed dark against the sky. Parents told their children never to go too deep into the trees. Old hunters, sipping whiskey in dim saloons, shook their heads when the story came up, muttering, "That land don't belong to men." The tragedy shaped how people saw the forest. For years, attempts to build large-scale logging camps in the San Gabriel stalled. Men signed on, then backed out at the last minute. Some companies abandoned plans entirely after workers refused to go into the higher canyons. On paper, the reason was the steepness of the terrain. In truth, it was fear, because whenever the 1885 expedition was mentioned, a silence followed, an unspoken agreement that some mysteries were better left untouched. In the early 1900s, Los Angeles began expanding water systems into the mountains. Engineers, surveyors, and work crews went deep into the San Gabriels to chart rivers and streams. And they, too, returned with uneasy stories. A surveyor named Harold Benton wrote in 1907, "The men say they hear voices at night, like faint singing drifting through the trees. They laugh when asked about it in daylight, but I see the fear in their faces when the sun goes down." Another crewman claimed they found remnants of wooden structures far from any known trails. Old fire pits, collapsed shacks, even rusted tools. When told of this, older residents nodded grimly and said, "That's Camp Angelus." But no complete camp was ever found. The forest had swallowed whatever was left. The story of the 11 survivors lingered like a wound that never healed. By 1910, none of them were alive. Each had died strange, lonely deaths. One threw himself from a bridge. Another locked himself in his home for weeks until he wasted away. 2 were found together, their bodies starved, even though food sat untouched. Nearby, not one of them died peacefully in their bed. Their deaths fed the legend, convincing many that the forest's grip had never released them. Some went so far as to say the 11 had never truly escaped, that what had come out of the mountains were only shells, carrying something inside that did not belong to this world. In the 1920s, as Los Angeles boomed with movie studios and freeways, writers rediscovered the tale. A few pulp magazines ran sensationalized versions. Cannibal Horror in California, or The Haunting of the San Gabriels. They painted the men as villains, as monsters, as madmen driven to unthinkable acts. But those who remembered the real story bristled. It was not simple madness, they insisted. Not hunger alone. Something darker had been at work. A retired sheriff, who had been part of the original questioning in 1885, gave an interview before his death. He recalled looking into the eyes of the survivors and saying, "I've seen men lie. I've seen men kill. I've seen men starve. But I've never seen eyes like that. It was like they were looking at something behind me. Something still in the room, though I couldn't see it." Even as Los Angeles grew into a sprawling city, the San Gabriel Mountains kept their reputation. Hikers and explorers reported unsettling feelings, strange silences, and the sense of being watched. Some swore they heard footsteps pacing just behind them, though no one was there. A few claimed to glimpse pale figures moving between the trees. At twilight. In 1935, a group of Boy Scouts camped near the upper canyons reported hearing chanting in the distance. Their leader dismissed it as echoes. But several boys later described the same sound, voices calling in unison, rising and falling like a hymn. The San Gabriel mystery became folklore. Families told it around campfires. Newspapers revisited it on anniversaries. And always the same question lingered. What had truly happened to those men? Historians argued. Some said it was nothing more than human weakness, starvation, exposure, and fear tearing men apart until only a handful survived. Others pointed to the strange details, the empty graves, the vanished bodies, the journals filled with whispers of watchers in the trees. In the 1950s, a historian at USC uncovered fragments of Captain Morton's lost journals. They were brittle, water-stained, half illegible. But one line stood out. "The 11 who walk beside me are not the 11 I let out." Something followed us. Something came with us. That single sentence reignited the debate. Did Morton mean guilt that the men were changed by what they had done? Or did he mean something more literal, that whatever haunted the forest had walked out with them? No one could say for certain. Even today, more than a century later, the 1885 forest mystery lingers in Los Angeles history. Hikers vanish in the San Gabriels every year. Most are explained falls, accidents, missteps, but some are not. Some vanish without a trace, just as those men did in 1885. Old-timers shake their heads and say, "The mountains keep what they want." And on cold, clear nights, when the wind slides through the canyons, there are those who swear you can still hear it. Faint voices like men calling out from deep among the trees. Some think it is only the wind. Others believe it is the missing, still lost after all these years. And a few whisper that it is not the missing at all, but the forest itself, reminding us that it remembers. The 11 who returned tried to live, but they never escaped. The 114 who never came back became part of the land. And the San Gabriel Mountains still stand, vast and silent, holding their secret. So the question remains, when 125 men entered those woods in 1885, how many truly returned?